Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Friday. Today, we're going to talk about a distinction that sounds subtle, but at the executive level, it changes everything. Today, we're going to talk about answering the question, what is the difference between presence and availability? And how this applies to CEOs, C-suite leaders, and those transitioning power to the next generation leadership. Most leaders think these things are the same, but they're actually not. Availability is access, presence is influence. And the higher you rise in leadership, the more dangerous it becomes to confuse the two. So let's break them down more clearly. So availability is access, presence is engagement. So availability is going to answer a few things. Can people reach you? Are you responsive? Are you accessible for decisions? Presence is going to answer other questions such as, when you show up, do people stabilize? Is your thinking clear? Is your nervous system regulated? And is your authority grounded? So think of availability as logistical and presence is psychological, or psychological influence. You can be on every email, on every call, in every meeting, and still not truly be present. Presence requires depth of attention. Availability fragments attention. So at senior levels, fragmentation erodes strategic clarity because availability often creates dependency. So when leaders over-index on availability, something subtle tends to happen. The organization begins to orient around them. So people start saying things like, let's wait until she weighs in, or I need his approval, or we shouldn't decide without her. So the leader becomes the bottleneck, essentially. It looks like involvement, it feels like being responsible, or feels like responsibility, but it's actually creating dependency. And if everything slows down when you step away as the leader, you haven't built presence. You've actually built reliance. Presence is how the organization operates when you are not there. Here's the deeper layer to consider. Presence is not just how you behave in the room, it's how your leadership continues to function when you're not in the room, when you are absent. So if your presence is internalized within your group, strategy is going to guide decisions without you. Values are going to regulate behaviors without your enforcement. Emotional tone remains steady under pressure without having to essentially run to you. And authority is respected even when you're not there. So availability says, you can reach me. Presence says, you can operate without me. Now that's true executive leverage. Presence is regulatory power. So when a CEO enters a room, the room calibrates to them. So if they are reactive or impatient or scattered or defensive, obviously the system is going to mirror this. Now, if a leader is grounded, they are measured, they are clear, and they are contained, the system is ultimately going to stabilize. So think of presence as also a nervous system event, right? At the executive level, your regulation becomes the organizational regulation. That's why presence scales. Availability doesn't. I'm going to say that again. Presence scales, availability doesn't. Availability without presence leads to micromanagement. And so when a leader feels responsible for everything, they increase their availability. They insert themselves into decisions, they override the emerging leaders, and they monitor excessively. So from the outside, it looks committed, but from the inside, it signals a lack of trust. And so true presence often looks like restraint, right? So it means being able to tolerate discomfort long enough to let others step forward. Presence requires ego containment. Availability often masks ego attachment. So this important piece that I'll talk about now is important for CEOs who are transitioning out. This becomes critical. Whether you're going from CEO to board or to ambassador, or you're retiring even. Leadership transition exposes this difference dramatically. So outgoing leaders often reduce their visibility, but maintain psychological control. They stay copied on emails. They informally advise teams. They re-enter decisions just to help. That's availability disguised as support. But presence during transition looks different. That sounds like, I trust your judgment. This is your call. I will not override you. I'm stepping back intentionally. I like how you executed that plan. Keep it up. If the organization still orients around that formal or outgoing leader, the successor never stabilizes authority. So that's a risk. So presence and transition actually means there's a clear transfer of decision rights, right? There's a visible endorsement of the new leader or leadership team, and obviously withholding unnecessary intervention, and allowing mistakes without reclaiming control. So that requires identity maturation, which I also talked about in a prior video. Because stepping away from availability can feel like stepping away from relevance, which is a threat response. So emerging leaders must build resilience around the concept of presence, not just visibility. So incoming executives often believe they must be hyper available to prove legitimacy. So they're going to join every discussion. They're going to respond instantly. They're going to over participate. They're going to escalate involvement. But legitimacy isn't built through access. It's built through coherence. So presence for leaders looks like this. They're listening before they decide. They're regulating before they react. They're clarifying directions consistently, and they're setting boundaries strategically. Presence builds psychological safety. Availability builds dependency. So here's the strategic shift. Availability spreads you horizontally, and presence is going to deepen you vertically. Availability answers operational questions, and presence shapes cultural alignment. So availability just manages the tasks, but the presence piece is actually going to build a system that works. So if your absence creates chaos, you've built access, not leadership architecture. But if your absence creates continuity, you've built presence. So those are signals to pay attention to. So here's the identity component, and I think this is where it gets personal, is many executives unconsciously fuse identity with being needed. So if I'm the decision point, or if I'm not the decision point, who am I? And if I'm not central, what's my value? So they remain available, not because the organization actually needs it, but because their presence, essentially their identity does. And so presence requires a stable inner architecture. It allows an executive to say something along the lines of my value is not dependent on constant involvement. And that's true executive maturity. So here's the core question I ask you for those listening is when you leave the room, does performance drop or remain aligned? And when you're unavailable, does anxiety spike or does the system function? And when you transition out, does authority transfer clearly or stay psychologically attached to you? So these are the signals to watch out for. So remember, again, availability makes you reachable and presence makes you replaceable in the healthiest sense. And the highest levels of leadership, replaceability is strength. It's not a threat. So before we close, I want to ask a few questions, reflection questions. So the first question to consider is, are you equating responsiveness with effectiveness? Does your team function strategically when you are absent? And are you building dependence or building leadership? Because real leadership is not about being constantly available. It's about being deeply present and building systems that carry your leadership forward without you. So if this conversation resonates with you, especially for those that are in C-suite roles or navigating leadership transitions, I encourage you to explore these intersections of identity, regulation, strategic alignment, and architecture more deeply. And you can find much more content that I provide on my YouTube or LinkedIn channels. So remember, leadership is not about absence. It's more about influence that endures beyond your presence in the room. Happy Friday, everyone. I'll talk to you soon.